I'm speaking with Suparno Banerjee, author of Indian Science Fiction, Patterns, History, and Hybridity, published by University of Wales Press, February 15th, 2021. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you, Cris, for asking me to come.
So first, how did you get into studying and writing a book on Indian science fiction?
That's a long narrative, and I'll be brief about that because I am from India, so I've been reading science fiction. So that has been my primary reading material from childhood, I would say, and later developed into a more professional interest. So I'm coming at this whole thing, I would say, both as a scholar and a fan of the genre. But later on, as I was doing my PhD, I should say this, that I've always been interested in various kinds of science fiction, not only Indian science fiction. So I was reading, and India has multiple linguistic tradition of science fiction. So I was primarily reading Bangla or Bengali science fiction, which is my first language, and then reading things in English, some stuff that has been translated from French and Russian, so various kinds of things like that. And I did want to pursue that as a more serious vocation, so I did my PhD with the focus on science fiction. So it was on Indian English science fiction, which further developed into an idea that, okay, if I've done it in English, if I've taken a look at the works that are produced in English language from India, I should probably look at the larger scene. There's so many different traditions of SF or science fiction, and I should look at it. Someone should look at it. And it's not to say that nobody was examining these traditions or anything, but there's not a lot of discussion, critical discussion or work going on, specifically in the sense of, let's say, with the approach of national literature or something that can be called Indian science fiction. Because there you have Bengali science fiction, Hindi science fiction, Marathi science fiction, English language science fiction, Assamese science fiction, so on and so forth. But I just wanted to see if I can find similarities, patterns, overlaps, connections. And there we have, that's what led me to writing the whole book, I think.
Okay. How many, so within the different Indian language traditions, do they translate books into, each other's traditions or I'm sorry, into each other's languages, I meant to say?
That's a very pertinent question. Yes, but not as much I would think they should, or I would expect they would. So there are translations, but I would say that there are probably more translations from non-Indian languages, like from English or primarily English, maybe a lot of translation from of Jules Verne exist, as you'd expect in almost any culture.
Right.
Some from Russian, I also know from Spanish, and recently there is this Bangla science fiction webzine called Pobisho. They have been doing a great job of translating various different kinds of science fiction into Bangla. It's in Bangla, so they're translating from other languages. But I would say cross-language translation within the Indian context exist, but maybe not as much as these. So you can find some works which has been translated from Hindi or Marathi into Bangla and vice versa. But I would not say that's a dominant trend. Maybe it would become a main trend because people are taking note now.
So I noticed, just looking at the table of contents, you go back, you start the history, you started in 1835, and that kind of surprised me, being able to go that far back with Indian science fiction. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh yes, surely. So before going that, I should probably clarify my approach here, because if you talk about Indian science fiction, many people would go back to the epics.
Mhm.
So that would be a lot further back, a few thousand years back.
Mhm.
But I started from the 19th century, unlike, and again, people can argue, they can have their own approach towards the genre. The genre is always fluid. There's nothing hard and fast that it has to be like this.
Mhm.
But the reason I went back to 1835 rather than to the epics as the beginning of Indian science fiction is that I was primarily looking at science fiction as a genre that functions within, let's say, a natural universe rather than out of supernatural volitions.
Okay.
So that was one of my categories.
Mhm.
And as you know, like genre boundaries are porous, and some people might argue it's not, that should not be the only thing.
Mhm.
We come to the early 1900s or mid 1900s for that matter. 1835, Kailash Chandra Dutt's journal of 48 hours, that's the one that I mentioned.
Mhm.
It's probably one of the first works of Indian science fiction, a journal of 48 hours of the year 1945.
Mhm.
See the futuristic aspect even in the title.
Mhm.
It's written in 1835. It's about the year 1945. So the reason I started there is that this is one of the first futuristic narratives which imagines specific events happening in the future. It's not necessarily futuristic in the sense of technological development or large social change or anything like that, but a huge novum there, if I may use Sylvin's word here, Darko Sylvin's word, is that this is basically depicting a rebellion against the British Empire.
Mhm.
If you look at the date, 1945 is very close to 1947 when India became independent.
Mhm.
So this one has this sort of prophetic vision, although in the story the rebels are defeated, but it focuses its action rather than the past or the present into the future. So that is something that was very new in Indian SF. And going by some of the other works, if you think about Fateh Bulgarin's in Russia, writing in Russia, and other works which are focusing on the future, this kind of follows similar pattern. And very soon, within 10 years, Shashi Chandra Datta writes The Republic of Orissa in 1845, which sets the action in 1916. So again, in far future, not far, but considerably far future, where the Indian state of Orissa and nearby area becomes independent after a successful revolution against the British.
Mhm.
So this revolutionary utopian quality that you often see in science fiction, from one perspective, does make these things as speculative works,
Right.
at new possibilities, bringing in novum, something that did not exist, but which was in the air. Obviously, at this time period, there's a lot of revolutionary activities are going on.
Mhm.
Or it will take on a big dimension very near future in the 1850s.
Was at this time, was science fiction sort of a safe way to get into political ideas that might otherwise not be allowed in a sense?
I do think so, because if you look at both these works, they're written in English. They're not written in any other language. So if they are written in English, published in an English language journal.
Mhm.
So I would say to some extent, they probably work as this dissociating devices for the authors so that they don't get into too much trouble.
Mhm.
but we don't really see anything like that for a few years after these two.
Okay.
Thing. We do see similar sort of utopian vision appear again early 19th century, but not around this period. We have some works of technology, journey, etc., coming up towards the end of the 19th century, which I also talk about in the book.
I'm speaking with Suparno Banerjee, author of Indian Science Fiction. You can find more information about his work on his page at Texas State University. If you like this episode of Full Contact Nerd interviews so far, please tap the like button and hit the subscribe button. If you want interviews with writers and creative people or daily book suggestions in sci-fi, fantasy, horror, film history, gaming, and more, check out fullcontactnerd.com and my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews. If you want to hear interviews with military historians or get daily history book suggestions, check out warscholar.org and my podcast, Military History Inside Out. If you want to hear interviews with space scientists, space historians, and technology experts, or get daily space and science book suggestions, check out technologyandspace.com and my podcast, Technology and Space. All of my social media links are listed at the end of this episode. Now back to the video.
So I also noticed that the idea of colonialism in sci-fi, that seemed to be something prominent in what you were studying. Can you talk about that?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the premises of my book is that Indian science fiction I shouldn't call it a byproduct, but it emerged because of the interaction with the Europeans. The way it emerged. Maybe it would have emerged in different ways if it was not the encounter with the British. But what we have now as Indian science fiction, it emerges during the colonial period. And one of my arguments is that this encounter, which I have mentioned as an alien encounter, and it has been mentioned or characterized as an alien encounter by, I think, Anil Menon, another prominent science fiction writer, some time ago, and I kind of caught on that the British are the other. The Indian encounter with the British, so Indian science fiction emerged as an alien encounter. There are many things to be said regarding that, I guess. But if we are looking at the 19th century works, almost all these works show some sort of response to this colonial encounter. So the first two I just mentioned very clearly why it is a colonial encounter. They are rebellions, millennial visions of the future. The later part of 19th century gives us, again, possibly the first technological story. At least I think that's more or less agreed upon at this point. Its name is Rahosyo. It comes out 1882. I'll just look at my timeline in the book to be certain. Okay, so 1882, Hemlal Datto's Rahosyo, written in Bangla, and call it the first narrative of technology and automation. So 1882 is pretty much the time when we are also seeing the development of SF in US or UK or in France or in the Latin Americas as well. So it's more or less the same time when we're seeing development in science fiction all over the world, in Russia. So we see sort of similar action here. And one describes an automated house in which our protagonist is, no, I shouldn't say trapped, it's his friend's house, but he's harassed by machines. Okay. And this happens in UK, in suburbs of London. He's a student in England, an Indian guy, a student in England. He's friends with this engineer chap who invites him over to his house, and there he encounters all these machines and harassed.
Mhm.
He runs away in the morning, basically. So kind of this uncomfortable. So you see again a very clear connection with colonialism. And the very fact that he was able to go to study in England obviously points towards his, and he was a student, he was not working at some lowly job or anything, which also points towards his privilege, possibly his privilege in the Indian society. And again, a colonial encounter. I also point at this educational system, the colonial educational system, and introduction of the westernized discipline of science. Westernized because there are various epistemological concerns that we can bring up. But the colonial science, let's say, which produced drastic social changes, one of which might be the Western-looking Indian bourgeoisie, upper class, and scientists, science education. So the couple of other works that we have, the very fag end of the 19th century, are written by a famous scientist, Jagadish Chandra Basu, about a cyclone that was somehow disappeared in the Bay of Bengal, runaway cyclone. That's translated as runaway cyclone, and it has been translated into English. And another one, A Travel to Venus, written by a science teacher, a school science teacher, and who Jagadananda Roy was also an ardent follower and writer of scientific topics. It's published as part of a book of scientific writing.
Yeah.
So if you look at these are very much connected, directly connected to the colonial issues. A couple of other works published in Hindi around this time they show very prominent influence of Jules Verne's Journey to the Moon, Earth to the Moon. Or I would say Edgar Allan Poe's Hans Pfaall. I think and there's a Journey to the Center of the Earth. So 1884, this is in Hindi. Pandit Ambika Datta Vyasa's Ashcharya Vrittant. So this one shows influence of Journey to the Center of the Earth. And 1900, Keshav Prasad Singh's Chandraloki Yatra, or Journey to the Moon. This one has been said that it just is influenced by Verne's work, but I think it's probably more Poe's Journey by balloon to the moon in Hans Pfaall. So this is translation, coming in through translation, Western influence of Western literature. So that's why I kind of start off or one of the main arguments of my book is that we see this hybrid quality from the beginning. It's been a response to various kinds of influence of colonization. It's not necessarily following colonial direction or rather colonial pattern. It's often a tool for resistance. As we can see at the very beginning, those were narratives of resistance, straightforward. And it keeps on going like that. There are many works starts coming up. We see influences of Wells, early 1900 SF. Possibly one of the first feminist utopias written in English language is also written in India. Begum Rokea's Sultana Stream, 1905, predates Gilman's Harland by at least 5 years or so. So that's why I kind of developed this idea when I've looked at these things, and then later on look at post-colonial writing, which keeps on showing some sort of relationship, not necessarily influence, that is by influence, I don't mean that they are looking at the Western writings and are doing something like that.
Right.
A lot of the time, they're struggling with these sort of ideas and identities, often rejecting Western notions, resisting Western notions, and sometimes also accepting them. So you can see a constant relationship that exists even now.
Mhm. Let me ask about sort of the period, say, I don't know, 1920 to 1960. You know, you in the US we had, you had serialized stuff like Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, and then you had, science fiction-y comic books, and then all the pulp sci-fi books. Did India start doing something like that too in that period, or?
Um, India, I would say that the whole pulp SF culture did not develop as strongly. It existed, and it exists, I should say, around that time as well, but it was not as strong as what you would see in US, I guess, or even in UK. But the first science fiction magazine, it's called Ashcharya, that came up, it was in 1963. So it's a little later, and I'd probably say it's more or less around the 60s and the 70s when we see this, I shouldn't say outburst, but a lot of production of science fiction, including the pulpy works like you mentioned, sometimes serialized work. But I would say science fiction series, the idea of series of some specific characters, adventure, and things like that, that started earlier. From the 1940s, we have possibly one of the most important SF series written by Premendra Mitra, Ghanada, Stories of Ghanada or Tales of Ghanada or Ghanada Dash. It's a series of stories starting from 1945, ending in the 80s when Mitra dies. So its central character is Ghanasham Dash as Ghanada by his flatmates. He lives in a kind of like a boys' hostel. He's a bachelor, possibly in the 40s or something, unmarried guy, and he tells stories. These stories are tall tales. But when you enter them, it can be anything. It can be about black holes, about aliens, about genetic experiments in different parts of the world, fighting with bad scientists. And there are so many. So it's a series of works, pop culture series of works starting from the 40s and up to 80s. And it's in Bangla. The couple more important series starts in the 60s, early 60s. Satyajit Ray's Professor Shonku series, stories of the scientist named Professor Shonku, inventor, goes up into the 90s. And Satyajit Ray is probably better known in the West as a filmmaker whose script actually said to have influenced Spielberg's E.T. deeply.
Interesting.
At some point, there was an allegation of theft of plot. But again, it remained an allegation.
So what is it? I think a lot of what you've mentioned, you said was written originally in Bangla, and I'm curious what region does that represent, and why is that so prominent?
I would say there are many language traditions, and one thing that I've mentioned more than once in the book is that this is sort of a flawed encyclopedic attempt. Flawed because it has to be flawed. There are hundreds of languages in India. The 22 languages prominently highlighted by Sahitya Academy, the institution of letters in India, as prominent literary language. I can read only 3 of them, including English. properly, English, Bangla, and Hindi. A little bit I learned during this process. I trained myself to read Assamese a little bit because it uses the same alphabet as Bangla. So I mentioned Bangla because I read Bangla.
Got it.
Okay. However, Bangla, Hindi, and Marathi are probably the most vibrant SF scenes. It has been. I mentioned all the works that I mentioned in 19th century. Most of them are written by Bengalis. The first two texts written in English, that too by Bengalis. And there are only a couple of Hindi texts that's come out towards the end of the 19th century. So it has taken root in Bangla fairly strongly from early on. It could be that if you look at the 19th century atmosphere, English education was, the colonial education system started taking root very firmly in Bengal province. It's towards the eastern part of India, which included the present country of Bangladesh, as well as the Indian state of West Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, and Assam. It was a huge state, maybe something like Texas in US during the British colonial rule. So again, I'm not exactly sure about the scale, but it was a huge state. That's why the comparison. So if you look at that, the root of education, which started taking firm approval from the Bengali bourgeoisie, middle class, it probably shows why it would also start producing science fiction there. If there is a connection to be made between colonialism and emergence of science fiction in India. Mm-hmm. But then again, it spreads pretty quickly all over India. Mm-hmm. And Hindi produces a lot of science fiction works. Marathi produces a lot of science fiction work. Probably presently Marathi has a very, very vibrant scene, as is Hindi science fiction. Assamese produces science fiction works. But other than Bengali and Hindi, I think most of these, at least that's what I found, most of them started producing SF works from the early to mid 20th century. Okay. So a genre became a lot earlier in Hindi and Bangla. So I guess that's why we keep on seeing these works in these languages. I should also mention 1920s and 30s also sees magazine SF culture, not science fiction magazines, but SF being published in magazines, both in Hindi and in Bangla, which is later on taken up by other languages.
Let me talk about, let me mention, before the country was divided, and you have Pakistan and India, was there much of a tradition? Do you go at all into what existed in what was the region of Pakistan before the division?
Yes. So here's the trouble of dealing with national traditions, right? What is the nation? So I do go into that in my introduction, that, and came up with this. Again, I don't argue that this is the only way of looking at it, but I thought it was more convenient way of looking at it. So I consider anything that was written before 1947 in the region known as India, which would constitute Pakistan as well as Bangladesh, as Indian SF. But after 1947, I did not take any look at any of the stuff that is being produced in Bangladesh and Pakistan, because it would be a different national tradition at this point after 1947. Right. So I mentioned Begum Rokeya, right, as one of the earliest feminist SF authors. So she is now claimed by Bangladesh as well, which was East Pakistan at the moment of divide. So any pre-1947 text, I did not really, I did not, what I should say, consider whether it can now be considered Bangladesh or Pakistan or India. I just took whatever being produced at that time.
Right.
Only after 1947, I focused on what is now India, as well as Indian diaspora.
Mhm. Oh, okay. Well, let me turn, just for time purposes, let me turn to how you did the research for this book. Um, Obviously, there's a lot. It involves a lot of reading of just the fiction, but tell me your approach.
Yes. So I think doing research for any book is difficult, but specifically when you have so many languages to deal with. So that's the biggest difficulty. So I stayed in India for a few months when I was doing my primary research. I already had a lot of material even before that, because it didn't materialize only over 2 or 3 years, but I have been reading this stuff for my whole life. So that was the easy part, I would say. I'm familiar with this. But I did visit the National Library, which has some decent collection of works. I was going through, there are lots of online resources, which was really great. And people are very generous sometimes. And again, I should not necessarily condone this practice, but if you look for material which are unavailable at this point, you may just come up on them as PDFs online.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You see what I mean? It's not condonable, because maybe they're kind of getting out copyright material, but sometimes they're not available. The only thing that is available is there.
Yeah.
You come up with a lot of the stuff that way, but then again, I had to depend primarily on translation,
Mm-hmm.
or either into Hindi or Bangla or English, from many of the other languages that I've dealt with. So I have primarily focused on Bangla, Hindi, English, but also Marathi. And fortunately, quite a lot of Marathi fiction has been translated into other languages. Mm-hmm. So that gave me some of the texts. Some of the Assamese writing has been translated. Some Tamil writing has been translated. So I talked with people who read these languages, who work in those, or at least dealt regularly with SF written in those languages, and got recommendations from them, and tried reading as much as I could. The biggest problem is that there's very little critical works out there. Mm-hmm. So in many cases, I'll probably be the first one kind of bringing all of these things together. But in some other cases, there are, like for Bangla, there are critical works out there. Some Hindi works, some regarding some Marathi works, you can find some stuff. There are, I shouldn't say there doesn't exist, but there are lots of works out there regarding Indian English science fiction out there by many people. Mm-hmm. So it was, absence of things was the most difficult, specifically critical discourses. And also, fortunately, my family has been hoarding stuff for years, for 100 years, regarding journals and books, including this sort of, so that helped.
I'm speaking with Suparno Banerjee, author of Indian science fiction. You can find more information about his work on his page at Texas State University. If you like this episode of Full Contact Nerd interviews so far, please tap the like button and hit the subscribe button. If you want interviews with writers and creative people, or daily book suggestions in sci-fi, fantasy, horror, film history, gaming, and more, check out fullcontactnerd.com and my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews. If you want to hear interviews with military historians or get daily history book suggestions, check out warscholar.org and my podcast, Military History Inside Out. If you want to hear interviews with space scientists, space historians, and technology experts, or get daily space and science book suggestions, check out technologyandspace.com and my podcast, Technology and Space. All of my social media links are listed at the end of this episode. Now back to the video.
Does the book focus just on writing, or do you get into movies and shows, more modern stuff as well?
Yes. So it starts from 1835 and ends in 2019 when the book is written. And I tried to cover, again, it's not, as I mentioned, it's not an encyclopedia or doesn't claim to be a definitive history, but it tries to put those things together so that others can start looking at those specific language traditions. But it covers overall, covers every kind of science fiction that has been produced. So that would include movies, TV shows, and everything. And I've tried to show the connections between, or how those fare, how the movies fare, how the literary trends fare, and so on and so forth. So yes, I do talk about that as well.
How about more recently, the video game industry? Do you get into any sci-fi video games made in India?
I have not.
Yeah.
So maybe that could be something for the future that I should look at. I know that some stuff are being made. Since I have kind of finished writing the manuscript, I've come upon some stuff, but I have not explored them, but I'm probably going to look at that in some sort of future work.
So when was the big period in India when they decided, you said people have been translating stuff, but was there a time, a specific year or range where people said, you know what, we need to translate more of this sci-fi for more audiences? Was there a publishing house that got into that or anything like that?
Are you asking about the inter-regional language translation?
Mm-hmm. Or and translating stuff into English that may not have been before.
Okay. When you're talking about the inter-regional language translation, it often happens that it's translated into English and maybe from there into other languages. So I would say in the 1990s, early 90s or something like that. I can't definitely say that nothing existed before that, might have existed, but it's mostly around the 1990s when we have cultural translations that starts appearing. And even at that time, I would also say translation into English started. Mm-hmm. And furthermore, I would say in recent years, last 5 years or so, there have been more translation of science fiction written in Indian languages into English. Recently, to the 2019, the Golan's book of science fiction, South Asian science fiction came out. It's an excellent collection, which consists of primarily English language SF, but it does contain, I think, 6 or 7 science fiction written in regional language translated into English. Mm-hmm. So to answer your question, I think mostly around the 90s, and it is slowly gaining, I think, impetus, translation into English.
Who are doing most of the writing of this sci-fi? Is it scientists who want to write, or is it more literary types who delve into science?
I would say both types. Just to give you an example, one of the most well-known Indian SF author who writes in English primarily is probably Vandana Singh, and she's a physicist, theoretical physicist, but she's also a wonderful author. If you just look at the way she writes, she's a wonderful author and she's a physicist. There are others who kind of fill that gap, but we also have, let's say in Bangla, Shishendu Mukherjee or Mukhopadhyay, Shishendu Mukhopadhyay, who is a mainstream major Bengali author who writes literary fiction and young adult fiction. He has also written a lot of science fiction works. So I would say it's both. Jayant Vishnu Narlikar, another major SF author, is another highly regarded astrophysicist who was, along with Sir Fred Hoyle, created the Hoyle-Narlikar continuum theory of gravity. So major scientist, major author in science fiction. But then again, you have Satyajit Ray, who's a filmmaker, who's a author of genre fiction and so on and so forth, who wrote science fiction at one point. So I would say there are all types of people who are doing these things. There are both kinds of people who are doing these things now, writing science fiction now, and that has been the case.
Mhm. Okay. So, obviously you love sci-fi. Was there part of this research that you enjoyed the most while doing it?
Um, I would say other than only probably being frustrated not finding a source, I enjoyed the most almost all the stuff.
Mhm.
Possibly reading the stories.
Mhm.
Possibly reading the stories, that's the most enjoyable part. But finding something new is also very, very enjoyable. That, okay, I found this thing. I was trying to find this before, didn't, but this is something new. I can talk about this. That's definitely the thrill of discovery, I guess. But more than that, I would say just reading the stuff.
Did you get to interview any of the people who are currently or recently wrote sci-fi or created sci-fi in India?
Yes, I did talk to some of these people, and they often help me think about. Like I mentioned, Anil Menon, who has written some very good SF novels and short stories. Talked with him, and he kind of gave me some good resources as well about translated science fiction from Tamil. And I've also talked with some other people at various stages of my research.
Do you know if so you mentioned also Indian writers who are part of the Indian diaspora. Um, do you see any issues with any of them connecting more with the nation in which they are rather than being an Indian writer of sci-fi? You know what I'm saying?
Yes, absolutely. And I've taken that, I have considered that. So I think the reason I decided to include Indian diaspora is that in most of these writings, you do get a very clear sense of, I shouldn't say Indianness, but Indian elements present clearly.
Mm.
So I did not see any reason for not including them if they're including that sort of elements in their writing. I think it does not take away their identity of being, let's say, an American author. They can be both at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
They can be an Indian American author, Indian diaspora, but they can also be an American author or a British author at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So for my purposes, it did make sense when I was looking at many of their writings. There are lots of very clear connections that this is rising out of Indian cultural base.
Are there how much do the writings from any of these eras take from or Indian religious tradition?
Oh, that's a major major issue. I have a whole half the chapter on that. Some would I think that's a very big issue to discuss. But let me put it in short. A lot of Indian SF, not all, but quite a number of them, deal with myths,
Mm-hmm.
primarily Hindu myths. Whether as a device of subversion or whether as reinterpretation or reestablishment, there are all sorts of things going on, but it does have a major, major role to play, mythical tradition.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say one thing, just think about how any kind of literature is created. There's always some sort of cultural base. And we do see regular allusions to Christian tradition as well as Greco-Roman tradition or Norwegian tradition in Western science fiction or literature in general, not necessarily overtly condoning or establishing or reinterpreting.
Mm-hmm.
I would say these Indian mythical traditions are in the fabric of the society. So if you are to write something, you might very easily slip into that sort of references. So there are there are many ways of looking at this. So if that is one of those, if those are some of the major cultural bases, people would obviously fall upon them in order to create the narratives. But there are some for whom these religious or mythical traditions becomes a tool for exploration of possibilities. For some time it becomes tools to establish some sort of Hindu nationalism, and sometimes to undercut that Hindu nationalism. But we do see a major presence of myths in the Indian SF tradition, in the languages.
What else maybe that we haven't mentioned would you point to as a marker of Indian science fiction, some cultural marker or something?
I would say like the two things that I mentioned, or rather we just discussed, one is a very acute awareness of its relationship to the West. At some point as a colonial oppressor, at some other point after the independence, I would say. Obviously not the colonial other, but something, some power, some imperial power that has an oppositional quality to Indian tradition. We often do see that a lot of the time in Indian language SF. By that I mean not English SF, but we also see a very strong quality of hybridity, which brings into their narrative universe influences and ideas from Western traditions, not necessarily literary or science fictional, but also about many other things like science and technology, and merging that with the local traditions. So we have both kinds of reaction. At some point it's oppositional, at other point it's a hybrid. It's more and more hybrid these days, specifically in the English language SF. From India, we do see a hybridity outnumber the oppositionality in that sense. But also, even in hybridity, there's often this subversive quality. Like, we are taking with these Western influences, but undercutting their original purpose. We often see that. I think Amitav Ghosh's Calcutta chromosome is probably one of the best examples of that sort of idea. This merger, this constant hybrid existence, I think is one of the major qualities that we see in Indian science fiction. That is not to say that every time you pick up a book, you will see that, but that is very dominant. And other than that, the majority does present or does create or build a world which is marked by Indian cultural references, very clearly marked by Indian cultural references.
Have there been any, just thinking of the Indian diaspora, any Indian sci-fi writers living who had lived in the Middle East, the Caribbean, or Africa?
I have not found them, but it doesn't mean that they don't exist. It's only that I have not read or found anything about that. Primarily, I've seen Indian American authors and some British Indian, and mostly that. But I know that there are some Indian authors who live in other European nations. There are, I think, Singaporean Indian authors, and so on and so forth. It might be just I didn't find them.
Okay. What did you come across that most surprised you?
It could be that there are so many languages in India that produces SF. I think that's probably the biggest surprise that I had. And also the fact that something that I was not aware of from between the 1910s and 1950s, that there are actually quite a lot of people who are writing science fiction works in India. So again, I did, so that's why it surprised me. But there are like small surprises like that here and there. But I think the couple of the biggest was that so many Indian languages actually produce science fiction. That itself was a surprise. I shouldn't say surprise, but that I was able to find them. That was the surprise. And that between the early 1900s produced, the number of SF it produced, I wasn't expecting that many, but there were quite a lot.
So you did mention that the book does have sort of a narrow focus based on certain constraints, but within that focus, was there a particular issue that you really wanted to sort of figure out, get an answer for, that maybe you finally did after a lot of effort, or you'd still love to know, about something?
Well, one should I think I should say that in every chapter of this book, which is kind of based on starting with a historical overview in general, that's the first chapter. Then the most interested I was about the topic in the second chapter, which is about the epistemic traditions, the different sorts of knowledge base from which the authors are coming, creating their texts. So I don't think there's a specific answer that I had from there. I was just looking at how many do we find and how are they dealing with that? That was the most fascinating part for me, because I did find, obviously, science as in the commonly understood sense of Western sense of science, technology science. On the other hand, you have something that has often been called Vedic science. That has been an idea championed by Hindu nationalists for a long time, even now. So that holds a pretty prominent position. And there are so many kind of other smaller, by smaller I mean localized traditions of knowledge, subaltern knowledge, only local knowledge. So I would keep an eye out for that, how many different kinds of those ideas that I can find and how they constitute the zero world of the author. Because every time, if you think about any sort of literary creation or artistic creation, comes from a zero world of the author. By that I mean it has some sort of relationship with the author's world. How does the author perceive the world, according to me, is based on this epistemic orientation. And if you are taking these various positions regarding the world that you're coming out of, that influences the way you construct the narrative world. I would say that was the most fascinating part for me, of the different kind of approaches that I saw. And I think the idea that I mentioned earlier, myth, the preponderance of mythical references, I think that comes out of this mythical worldview that often is prominently present in many of these authors' writing. So that is something I would further develop. In fact, I am writing an essay on Shishendu Mukhopadhyay's science fiction. For some reason it fell, so I'll just take it down. The set collapsed. And in Mukhopadhyay's works, we do see a wonderful interaction of that sort of across the epistemic positions. So that is something I'm really fascinated with and will probably look at more.
So this kind of work is, you're probably not going to have emotional impacts necessarily from what you're looking at, but did you come across anything that did move you emotionally, either positively or negatively?
I should say this thing. I think I don't get emotionally moved a lot by even emotional narrative. So I can't really say if anything moved me emotionally, but I am really happy with the number of stuff that are being produced. So that people are paying attention. People are writing science fiction. New books are coming out, both in English language as well as in other Indian languages like in Bangla or Hindi, and translations are happening. Critical works are being written. My book was actually released in UK in November or end of October 2020. So 2020 produced 2 critical works on Indian science fiction. This one, and there's another one, Final Frontiers, which was taking a look primarily at Bangla science fiction, published by Liverpool University Press. That was oriented towards Bangla science fiction, but this is probably the only work that exists that tries to encompass the entire national tradition. But you have 2. And I know there's another book coming out by Sami Ahmed Khan, who is also a wonderful science fiction author, in the sense of like he has published 2 novels. I think 2 novels, yes. And his book on Indian English science fiction is coming out. So that makes me happy as a person who is highly interested in the field, invested in the field, that it's continuing to grow. I think that's probably, if you're looking for an emotional response. So that's probably it.
That works. Who are the big, does India have big publishing houses that focus on sci-fi the way the West does?
I don't think there's any specific house that specializes in science fiction, but as I mentioned, like Golan's has published now this. Then you have, I believe, Hatchet India has published some. NBT, which is National Book Trust, actually has published quite a few science fiction translated from other languages. The translation culture that I was mentioning has published quite a few translated works. But I don't think there's any specific publishing house that specializes in science fiction, at least not to my knowledge, which is not necessarily to say that I'm aware of all the publishing fields there.
Okay. Did you have any difficulty getting this book finished or getting it published, getting a publisher?
No. Not actually. What I would say that the series editor was suggesting that I should finish writing this book as soon as possible and bring it to them. So Patrick Sharp, the series editor for New Dimension in Science Fiction, or UWP, and they were wonderful to work with. They're supportive and very positive. So the publishing process was actually very enjoyable. Mm-hmm. I don't think everybody says that, but this is the case, definitely here.
Wait, so were you approached to do the book based on people knowing about your research, or did you pitch it to someone?
No, because of my already existing research, I think.
Okay.
I wouldn't say it was sort of a conversation between me over the few years with the series editor, Patrick Sharp, and he said, like, you should do this, like, you should finish this and make a book about it, because my work on Indian SF have been out there for I think for a decade now. So people have read it, have presented in conferences. So he encouraged me to finish this thing and did.
Okay. And what's your current writing project?
So I'm working on a book chapter on Shishendu Mukhopadhyay, the one that I was just mentioning a little earlier. So that's one, and then there is another one on a post-national trend in Indian science fiction for a journal. But something that I'm thinking about, maybe a little larger in scale, could actually be a translation project that I'm it's still very vague. I'm thinking about maybe early works which has not been translated into English. I read Bangla and Hindi. I was thinking about maybe trying to collect some of those short stories, translate them, and then think about publication. So that might be a bigger project back there, but it's definitely in my head. So I should mention that.
So when you read science fiction, do you read, if you have ideas, if you're reading it and it gives you ideas, at an academic level, at a research level, do you force yourself to finish reading what you're reading to enjoy it? Or do you, stop and take notes constantly as you read?
I always finish reading first.
Yeah.
Let's finish reading first. In fact, I'm not really a note taker. Even when I was doing my research, I have very few notes when writing books. I kind of function if I just remember stuff. It's mostly in my head, notes in my head.
Okay.
Yes, I finish reading and then go to write something.
Mm-hmm. What, and I don't want this question to maybe get you in trouble in any way, but what's your favorite sci-fi, well, first, your favorite Indian sci-fi, and also, is that the same as your favorite overall sci-fi, or is it something different?
Again, it's a very difficult question to answer because I don't have a specific work that I can point at as my favorite, but there are quite a few. In no order of preference, what comes to my mind now, I can just mention some of the ones that I like a lot. I like if I start with Indian writers, I like Vandana Singh's works a lot. Her Distances is one of my favorite, but then again, there are other works. Then I like Premendra Mitro's works, the one that I mentioned earlier, the writer of Kannada. I like his works a lot. And again, there are so many. Calcutta Chromosome by Amitav Ghosh, that's one. And gosh, there's so many to mention. So these would be something that just popped in my mind at this moment.
Right.
But I read a lot of Russian science fiction as well. So I would say Strugatsky brothers is, again, some of Strugatsky brothers' writing are my favorite. So Roadside Picnic would be one. Mm-hmm. Stanislaw Lem's Solaris, that's another one. I like Ursula Le Guin a lot. Left Hand of Darkness is one of my favorites. And Ian MacDonald's River of God, which is set in India. It's a wonderful novel. Again, as I said, these are some that's coming to my mind at this moment.
No, I understand. Yeah.
There are so many more.
Well, do you prefer reading to watching shows and movies, or do you balance it out?
I would say I balance it out. I like SF movies a lot as well as reading them. Mm-hmm. Not so much maybe TV shows. I shouldn't say I don't like it. I just didn't get an opportunity to watch them a lot. Well, although I finished all seasons of Expanse recently, which is really great. But I like it in all forms. Mm-hmm. That's probably the best way of putting it.
Okay. So where can people find you online to follow your thoughts or updates on your work?
I'm barely active on social media. So for a person who works with technology and stuff, conceptually, I'm not really that much active online, but I do have a following. Like I do have a presence on Facebook under Suparno Banerjee. Mm-hmm. I do have a Twitter handle, but I don't even remember what it is. Yeah, okay. Because it's so little. But most of my research work are kind of listed under my profile on my Texas State University website faculty page. So it's there if anybody wants to look at it. And I think some of those articles are also linked to text and stuff like that. Okay. So that would be the easiest way to find me. And it also has my email and stuff like that.
And I'll spell your name for listeners. It's Suparno, last name Banerjee. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All
Yes.
right, all right. Okay, that's all the questions I have. Do you have any parting thoughts or words?
Read more Indian science fiction.
Yeah,
They're great works. A lot of these are available, which was a case, not the case a few years ago. I think a lot of these works are now being available in the West. And again, I think probably the primary target audience is located in the West. That's what I'm saying. Many works are being translated now, so it would become even more accessible. Um, there are lots of great stuff out there, so I would just say just read them.
yeah, I agree. I agree.
Yeah.
Get a different flavor of sci-fi in a sense.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thank you for inviting me.
In the next episode, I speak with David Church about modern horror films. Hit the subscribe button to catch that episode. Thank you for watching this video version of Full Contact Nerd Interviews. If you liked the episode, please subscribe and hit the like button. If you'd like more book suggestions or information on fiction and storytelling, including sci-fi, horror, fantasy, mysteries, thrillers, film history, gaming, and more, please check out my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews, my YouTube channel, Cris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, and my webpage, chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. If you're looking for military history and general history, including true crime, please check out my YouTube channel, War Scholar, my podcast, Military History Inside Out, and my webpage, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you're looking for space history and the science, technology, and business of space, check out my YouTube channel, Spacewalks Money Talks, my podcast, Technology in Space, and my website, technologyandspace.com. Thank you for watching, and keep imagining the past, the present, and the future. Hello, I'm Cris Alvarez, and perhaps you can't tell by looking at me, but I am a nerd. I've been a nerd for many years, and I'm good at it. In this show, I'd like to give you the tips on how to be the most successful and well-informed nerd that you can possibly be. I speak with interesting people about cool things. Please join us if you're so inclined. This is Full Contact Nerd Interviews, and welcome. Suave, that was suave, right? Yeah, that was good. Darling.